Hello and welcome to the 8th video then in this series, making Space Invaders with some simple JavaScript and HTML. This video then we're going to make what's called our game loop. So most games, in fact all games I've ever seen, have what's known as a game loop. Essentially it's a function to update everything that's called X number of times per second. So if we're doing 60 frames a second, we will call a function 60 times a second to update everything on the board. That'll be bullets, collisions, positions of enemies, anything you like that it requires some kind of delta in time to be updated, then moving on the game playing area. To do that, we're going to need to add some variables and some settings into defs.js. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a target frames per second. And here we have 1000 divided by 60. That's 1000 milliseconds divided by 60. So our target is to have 60 frames per second. In the game manager, I'm going to add some more variables. I'm going to add a variable called last updated, and that's going to be set to now. This is going to be the variable that says the last time we called one of our update functions. We're going to use that to calculate how long it was since the one before that, so we know the amount of time that was elapsed. The other thing we're going to store, well, two more variables. One is the total playing time elapsed. We won't actually use this in this game, in this series, but it's nice to have in there. I imagine after this series you might want to extend the game in some way if you want to try some of the things out. Having elapsed time is always good. And we're going to keep track of the actual frames per second that the game is managing to run at. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to go into index.html and we're going to make another div with the score class, and I'm going to call this one, I'm going to give it another ID as we've done for the high score and stuff, and call this div FPS, and we're going to show our frames per second inside here. We'll set it to 0 to start with. And the thing remaining now is to go into main.js and actually set up a function that will be called up to 60 times a second. I call this function tick. And in here, first thing to do is set up a couple of variables. The first one is to get the current date and time, so what time it is now, and then calculate the time that's elapsed since we last did an update. That will be now minus GameManager.lastUpdated. We can now update GameManager.lastUpdated to the now because we've got the delta time, and next time we call the function, the same calculation will give us the new data time. And now we can calculate the frames per second, and we'll force those to be an integer rather than some crazy long number with lots of decimal places. So 1000 divided by our delta time will give us the number of frames per second we're managing. As we've done inside our player class, or sorry, in our sprite class, we'll update the contents of the div, in this case the div with the ID div FPS. And the last thing we'll do is we'll do something that comes with JavaScript called setting a timeout. Here we give a function, which is our tick, and we say how many milliseconds we want elapsing before we call this function. And in our case, we want gameSettings.target frames per second, and that will give us call tick again after that number of frames per second, after that amount of elapsed time, which is the 1000 divided by 60. And then when tick gets called again, the same thing happens, and it gets called, and so on, and we can look at the frames per second updating on the screen. The only thing to do is put this set timeout at the end of init so it actually gets set going and we're ready to go. A quick word on set timeout. I'm saying call tick every X milliseconds. There's also set interval, which would just keep calling tick repeatedly until we cancel that particular interval. The reason I haven't done that, and I think you'll find most frameworks and games don't use set interval, is we're guaranteeing that we finish all of the updating we'll be doing in here, which will be quite a lot by the end of the game, before we then go and ask tick to be called again. If you use set interval, you can find that things end up overlapping and strange things can happen. So it's best, in my experience anyway, to use set timeout. It doesn't seem to really hit the performance much at all, and guarantee that you've completed all the updating and calculations you want to do inside tick before you then call tick again. So let's have a flick over to the browser. And now you can see on the left hand side we've got frames per second. It's sort of saying 58, 62, 60, around there. Let's just quickly go back into defs. Change the target frames per second to 10 and slow it right down. Back to the browser and refresh. And now you can see we've got 9, 10, 9, 10, 9, 10, 9. So we have what we can assume is a relatively accurate representation of the frames per second we want in the game. I'll just reset that now back to 60 before I get confused later on in the series. And that's actually it for this video. Relatively simple, but quite a key thing to the game, making a function that's recalled every X frames per second. That's our target, so we can do all of the logic, game logic, and updating of the positions of the enemies and things like that on screen. So shorter video than usual, but I hope it made sense. As usual, please leave me a question or a comment or whatever. Otherwise, thanks for watching and see you in the next one.